The trading floor erupted with chaos as red numbers bled across every screen, and the entire market seemed to collapse in seconds. Charles Bennett stood frozen, his tailored suit clinging to him as sweat gathered at his collar. He had been celebrated as a genius for years, a fearless CEO whose empire stretched across industries. Yet in that moment, everything he had built trembled. His heart raced as traders screamed, phones rang non-stop, and desperate voices cut through the air. Charles said, "This can't be happening. We were secure. We were prepared." His words were lost in the deafening noise of despair. Across the room, Samuel Klein, the trusted sidekick, shouted for immediate orders, but Charles' eyes stayed locked on the cascading figures, a storm consuming his vision. Financial anchors spoke in grim tones on muted televisions, their headlines scrolling with words like collapse, fraud, and betrayal. The empire that had taken decades was unraveling in seconds, and everyone knew it. What no one yet understood was that this collapse was not only numbers on a screen, it was the beginning of the end for Charles Bennett. The trading day ended in ruins, but Charles remained rooted in his office, blinds closed against the city skyline. The silence was suffocating compared to the frenzy earlier. He sat at a polished mahogany desk, staring at balance sheets covered in losses. His empire, once hailed as unstoppable, was bleeding from every corner. Samuel entered quietly, his face pale, and said, "Charles, we have hours, maybe less. Creditors are circling like vultures." Charles looked up slowly, his eyes dull, and whispered, "I planned for storms, Samuel. But this is a hurricane." The sound of rain pattering against the windows grew louder, mirroring the heaviness in the room. Behind him, the television still played silent financial updates, each one a nail in the coffin. In that dim office, Charles knew the fall had only just begun. The next morning, rumors spread across boardrooms and news outlets like wildfire. Charles faced his executive team in the glass conference room, their voices sharp and accusatory. He tried to maintain composure, speaking with a steady tone, but his words lacked conviction. Elizabeth Carter, the investor, folded her arms tightly and said, "We trusted you with billions. Where did it all go?" Charles swallowed hard, shifting papers as if answers hid there. Samuel intervened, his voice defensive, but the executive's anger was louder. Outside, camera flashes erupted as reporters waited. The world demanded blood, and Charles was the easiest target. Later that day, Daniel Price, the whistleblower, sat in a dim archive room, boxes of old financial documents stacked high. His fingers moved quickly across spreadsheets filled with anomalies. He muttered, "They won't hide this anymore." His face carried the weight of both fear and determination. Each page confirmed his suspicion: corruption and reckless risks buried under clever accounting. Daniel knew exposing this truth could destroy not only Charles' empire but his own safety. Still, he gathered evidence, his hands shaking as the reality became undeniable. The first threads of betrayal had surfaced. That evening, Charles met Richard Hale, the fallen mentor, in a quiet cigar lounge lit by amber lamps. The heavy smell of smoke clung to the air as Richard leaned back, eyes shadowed with regret. Richard said, "I thought I was untouchable once, Charles. Then the market chewed me alive." Charles listened, uneasy, swirling a glass of scotch in his hand. Richard's words were not comfort but warning. "The higher you climb, the harder the ground hits when you fall," Richard added, his tone sharp with bitterness. Charles forced a weak smile, but deep inside he knew the words carried a truth he could not ignore. Morning brought no relief, only sharper edges and colder light. Charles convened emergency calls with lenders while the city yawned awake. He drafted contingency plans that felt like bandages on open wounds. Samuel compiled cash positions and liquidity windows with grim precision. Charles said, "We cut fast or we drown." The words hung like frost in the air. Departments were flagged for freezes, vendors for renegotiation, and projects for the axe. He swallowed pride and rang rivals for bridge terms no one would extend. Samuel said, "We can sell the non-core assets first. Charles nodded, pretending this was strategy, not surrender. The screens glowed with decimal places that determined fate. He felt the clock's pressure as a physical force. Somewhere a printer hummed, spitting out the future in black and white. By midday, the investor call sounded like a tribunal. Elizabeth's voice cut through the static with courtroom clarity. She said, "Transparency now, or funding ends." Charles steadied his breath and shared the plan in disciplined beats. He framed asset sales as strategic and layoffs as surgical. Questions hit like hail on glass. Samuel interjected with numbers that proved survival, not victory. Elizabeth said, "Covenants were breached once already." A pause swelled, heavy and metallic. Charles promised weekly audits, daily dashboards, and independent oversight. The silence that followed felt like a verdict deferred. Cameras waited in the lobby as if smelling blood. Charles closed the laptop and stared at his reflection in the screen. Afternoon brought a new pressure front with the arrival of Victor Lang. His reputation entered the room before his handshake. Victor said, "I provide certainty when markets fail." The terms that followed were iron wrapped in velvet. He wanted assets at a discount, warrants with teeth, and control clauses that suffocated. Charles measured each word like a surgeon weighing a risky cut. Samuel said, "These terms bind us to his trigger." Victor smiled as if hearing a compliment. He tapped a pen and let the silence do the selling. The offer glittered like a life raft with hidden anchors. Charles felt the ground tilt toward a choice he would not be able to unwind. They stepped into the corridor where the carpet swallowed sound. Samuel said, "Walk from him. We still have options." Charles traced a finger along the rail as if reading Braille. He listed remaining buyers and their likely demands. Each path narrowed into the same funnel. Samuel said, "We can buy time with a managed release." The plan would calm suppliers and signal discipline. Charles weighed the optics against the burn rate that gnawed by the hour. He stared at the city's glass canyon and felt very small. Samuel lowered his voice and said, "Do not trade the company for a rumor of safety." Charles nodded, but the ache of urgency persisted like a siren in his blood. News of the collapse filtered down to the smallest rooms. Olivia Reed stared at a brokerage app that no longer showed a future. Her savings had been a bridge to a modest dream. She whispered to no one as the numbers dimmed like a dying constellation. In the office lobby, a crowd formed around a screen streaming headlines. Charles walked past and caught a fragment of her grief. The story he managed now lived in other people's kitchens and hearts. He felt a new weight that spreadsheets could not hold. Samuel said, "We will set up a hotline and relief guidance." Charles nodded, knowing it would be a thimble in a flood. The elevator doors closed on the sound of someone crying. Victor's presence spread through the board like smoke in a closed room. His offers came wrapped in legalese but poisoned with control. Charles tried to keep his voice firm, stating they would consider terms, but inside, doubt swelled. Samuel shifted uneasily, sensing the trap hidden beneath the polished words. Victor said, "You're cornered, Charles. I can open a door, but only I choose where it leads." The boardroom fell into tense silence, each director avoiding eye contact, afraid of siding with a man already marked by collapse. The pen in Victor's hand tapped with rhythm, a sound more dangerous than shouting. Charles knew the empire was sliding from his grip, yet pride forced him to mask the fear burning within. Richard met Charles in a quiet cafe tucked away from Wall Street noise. His voice was heavy with memory as he told of his own fall. He said, "I thought I could outwit the market. Pride blinded me until the ground was gone beneath my feet." Charles leaned forward, hungry for wisdom, desperate for hope. Richard's eyes carried a warning more than advice. The system doesn't forgive. It only waits to devour the next in line. The cafe's hum faded as Charles absorbed the words. He clutched his coffee cup like an anchor, but the heat felt faint compared to the chill in his chest. Richard's caution was clear. Survival meant sacrifice, and the cost would be unbearable. Daniel worked in shadows, Papers spread across his desk like a battlefield. His fingers raced across highlighted lines in financial records, anomalies stacked into undeniable evidence. He whispered, "They buried losses under layers of false gains." The fluorescent light above flickered, as though warning him to stop. Every page told a story of deceit, of hidden debts passed off as assets. His chest tightened as he realized the scope. The empire was rotting from its very core. Daniel paused, staring at the door, half expecting someone to burst in and seize the files. Fear clawed at him, but resolve burned stronger. He knew what he held could destroy Charles' empire, but also perhaps save others. Charles stood before the mirror in his private office, convincing himself the storm could still be tamed. He practiced phrases for shareholders, rehearsed strength he no longer believed. Samuel entered with grim reports, urging him to face the truth. Samuel said, "Denial is poison. We need action, not performance." Charles waved him off, forcing a smile that cracked at its edges. He repeated, "This is temporary. The markets rebound. They always do." Yet his reflection revealed the fracture, a man gripping illusions as tightly as life itself. Behind him, rain streaked down the windows, the city a blur of lights, indifferent to his unraveling. News reached the ground level where workers whispered in hallways and families scanned headlines with dread. Olivia sat at her kitchen table, a stack of bills beside her, her child tugging at her sleeve. She whispered, "I don't know how we'll make it through this." In that small apartment, Charles' decisions echoed louder than boardrooms and trading floors. The collapse was no longer abstract but painfully real. Jobs were on the line, homes at risk, and lives unraveling far beyond his office. Every number on his balance sheet translated into human loss. Olivia's tears blurred the ink on unpaid bills, her child's innocent voice asking if dinner was ready. The empire's fall had become everyone's burden. The morning began with whispers that turned into roars when secret documents hit the press. Hidden deals, offshore accounts, and reckless loans were exposed for all to see. Charles sat in his office staring at the headline, his name etched in bold letters of disgrace. Samuel burst in, voice trembling as he said, "It's out, Charles. They know everything." Phones rang endlessly, each one carrying another demand for explanation. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing like lightning storms. Charles rubbed his temples, his breath shallow as he realized the betrayal was bigger than he had imagined. What he thought were lifelines were poisoned chains, now shackling him to ruin. The boardroom felt colder than ever as Samuel's frustration finally broke. He slapped a report on the table and said, "You can't keep ignoring reality." Charles tried to steady his voice, insisting that survival required risk. His eyes darted across the room where silence spoke louder than any accusation. Samuel's jaw tightened, his loyalty cracking under the weight of decisions he could no longer defend. He said, "You're leading us over a cliff, and I won't follow." Charles leaned back, fighting for composure but inwardly shaken. The bond that once anchored him was fraying, and the room smelled of inevitable betrayal. When Elizabeth withdrew her funding, the room fell silent, except for the soft click of her pen as she signed the notice. She looked directly at Charles and said, "I will not burn with you." Her tone was icy, every word final. Charles tried to protest, speaking of rebounds and strategies, but her decision was already written in ink. Samuel lowered his eyes, unable to mask the defeat washing over him. The withdrawal was not just money vanishing, it was faith evaporating, leaving Charles stranded. The empire had lost its anchor, and the storm outside now had free rein. Daniel delivered the evidence with trembling hands, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. He said, "This isn't a mistake, Charles. It was sabotage from within." The files laid bare showed Victor's manipulation, weaving control through hidden clauses and forged partnerships. Charles felt his stomach twist as the truth unfolded before him. Betrayal had not come from strangers but from the very people he once trusted to guide his empire. Samuel stared at the pages, his face pale as the scope of deceit became undeniable. For Charles, the final thread of certainty unraveled into ash. Charles sat alone in his private lounge, a glass of untouched whiskey at his side. The realization had sunk in. His empire was not stolen by chance, it was dismantled piece by piece by those he trusted most. He whispered into the empty room, "I was blind, and they saw everything." Outside, the city pulsed with indifferent light, a reminder that the world moved on even as his own crumbled. The weight of betrayal was heavier than financial ruin. He understood that tomorrow would not bring answers, but final judgment. The man who once commanded boardrooms now sat in silence, awaiting the inevitable collapse. Charles entered the boardroom with the intensity of a soldier stepping onto a battlefield. His empire was ashes, but he still clutched the illusion of control. On the polished table lay a stack of contracts, his final gamble. He said, "This deal will save us or bury us." Samuel's eyes widened with dread, his voice breaking as he urged restraint. Yet Charles' mind was set, the desperation of a man cornered outweighing logic. The signatures meant risking what little remained for a shot at redemption. Silence thickened as the pen moved, every stroke echoing like a drumbeat of destiny. Outside, storm clouds swirled, as if nature itself mirrored the chaos within. Richard met Charles in a dimly lit corridor, his face shadowed by the weight of regret. He spoke with urgency, his voice sharp and tired. Richard said, "This deal is poison. Once signed, there's no return." Charles tried to mask his unease, his jaw clenched as he muttered about survival. Richard shook his head, eyes filled with the pain of his own past mistakes. He added, "You're not gambling for profit anymore, you're gambling for scraps." Charles turned away, unwilling to face the truth in those words. For a fleeting moment he looked older, as if the empire's collapse had stolen years from him. Victor arrived with an entourage, his calm demeanor concealing the trap beneath the polished smile. He spread the final agreement across the table, his tone smooth as silk. Victor said, "This is your last chance, Charles. Sign, and I'll stabilize your empire." Charles glanced at Samuel, who shook his head with urgency. The choice hung between fleeting hope and certain ruin. Victor's presence filled the room, calculated, patient, dangerous. Charles' hands trembled as he reached for the pen, the sound of rain outside beating like a ticking clock. Every second felt irreversible, each breath drawn tighter, until he pressed the ink to the page. Samuel's voice cut through the room like a blade. He said, "Stop this, Charles. You're throwing us into a pit we can't escape." Charles, eyes hollow but defiant, replied, "There's no path back, only forward." The tension crackled like electricity, the clash of loyalty and desperation. Victor leaned back, content to let the struggle unravel in front of him. Samuel's hand slammed the table, his loyalty breaking under the weight of choices he could not defend. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Charles' pen finally touched the paper, and Samuel knew the battle was lost. The decision sealed the fate of all who had stood with him. As the ink dried, Charles realized the gamble was lost. The promised rescue unraveled instantly into crushing terms. Victor's smirk widened as control shifted fully into his hands. Samuel turned away, his silence sharper than words. Charles whispered, "It's gone," his voice cracking as if admitting to himself what pride had concealed. Outside, thunder rolled, echoing the collapse of his empire. The skyscraper that bore his name was no longer his. The empire he built over decades slipped away in one night, leaving him with nothing but regret. In that moment, Charles Bennett was not a titan, but a man undone by risk. Charles confronted Victor in the dimly lit conference room, the silence broken only by the hum of the city outside. His voice trembled between rage and desperation as he said, "You orchestrated this, every step of it." Victor leaned back with a smile, his calmness cutting deeper than words. He replied, "You signed willingly, Charles. The market didn't take you down. You did." Charles' hands balled into fists on the table, but he knew it was too late to fight. The empire had already slipped from his grasp, and now Victor owned both the ruins and the narrative. The confrontation ended not with a roar, but with the hollow weight of defeat. The whistleblower's evidence erupted across television screens and headlines. Daniel faced the cameras, his voice steady as he laid bare the corruption and manipulation that had fueled the collapse. He said, "This was no accident. It was engineered greed." Journalists scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing like lightning. Charles watched from his office, each word carving into his legacy like a blade. The world no longer saw him as a visionary, but as a cautionary tale. Daniel's truth was a mirror, exposing rot long denied. For Charles, it was not just financial ruin but the death of his reputation in real time. In a small apartment far from the towers of glass, Olivia sat by the window with unpaid bills spread before her. The company collapse had stripped away her savings, her future hanging by a fragile thread. She whispered to herself, "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Her child's laughter in the next room cut through the silence, reminding her of what was at stake. Charles' empire had destroyed more than numbers. It had shattered lives that would never appear in quarterly reports. Olivia's tears streaked her cheeks, but she forced herself to stand. The cost of his failure was now carried by those who had no choice in his risk. Alone in his office, Charles collapsed into the leather chair, the weight of ruin pressing down on him. His head rested in his hands, his breathing uneven as silence swallowed the room. He muttered, "It's all gone," his voice barely audible. Memories of victories, applause, and power felt like ghosts haunting him now. Samuel entered quietly, his face lined with exhaustion, but he said nothing. There were no more strategies, no more lifelines. Only the raw truth remained. Charles Bennett had gambled everything and lost. His empire had crumbled, and with it, his sense of self. The man who once towered now sat broken, staring into emptiness. Victor stood at the top of the skyscraper, surveying the city as if it already belonged to him. The empire he had coveted was now in his grasp, absorbed piece by piece. He smiled faintly, not in triumph but in cold satisfaction. For him, this was business, nothing more. Charles' downfall was just another acquisition, another notch in a ledger of conquests. Down below, employees streamed out of the building carrying boxes, their futures uncertain. The skyline glittered, indifferent to the lives altered forever. Victor turned away, his shadow stretching long across the floor, a symbol of control built on another man's ruin. Charles sat in a modest apartment, stripped of luxury and power, his gaze lost in the faint glow of a single lamp. He whispered, "It's gone. All of it." His voice carried neither rage nor denial, only quiet resignation. The empire he had built was now nothing but memories of glass towers and flashing tickers. The silence pressed against him like a verdict that would never lift. He realized that the wealth he chased had dissolved, leaving only emptiness. For the first time, he was no longer a CEO, only a man confronting the wreckage of choices he could not undo. Richard sat across from Charles in silence, his weathered face etched with lessons carved by failure. He finally spoke, "I told you, the market never forgives." Charles looked down, unable to meet his eyes. Richard's tone softened, carrying no gloating, only a sad recognition. "We're men who thought we could bend the tide, but it always drags us under." Charles gripped his glass of water tightly, realizing that Richard was not only a mentor but a mirror. Both men were bound by the same story: ambition, collapse, and regret. The torch of failure had been passed, and Charles now carried it fully. Samuel sat in his own office, stacks of papers untouched, his loyalty torn to shreds by the collapse. He thought of all the times he had warned Charles, of the loyalty he had given freely. He whispered to himself, "I followed too far." His voice carried bitterness and grief. The collapse had not only ended Charles' reign, but had shattered Samuel's faith in his own judgment. He stared out the window, the city alive and indifferent, and realized he must now rebuild on his own. The partnership that once felt unbreakable was gone, leaving only fractured trust and unspoken blame. Olivia stood at her kitchen counter, bills still stacked but a quiet strength in her eyes. She whispered, "We'll find a way." Her child hugged her tightly, sensing the unspoken promise. Though the collapse had stolen savings, It had not stolen her resolve. She poured tea with steady hands, a simple act that felt like defiance against despair. The storm had broken her illusions, but it had also revealed resilience she didn't know she carried. For Olivia, survival meant more than numbers. It meant holding on to hope, even in the shadow of ruin. Charles walked alone through the city at night, the towers that once bore his name glowing high above, indifferent to his fall. He stopped at a street corner, staring up at the skyline with haunted eyes. He whispered, "All risk, no return." The words lingered in the cold air like a confession to no one. The crowd flowed past him, strangers who had no idea they brushed against a man once at the top of the world. He realized that history would not remember him as a visionary, but as a warning. The silence of the city swallowed him, and with it, the last echo of what he had been.